The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast, where we unravel the psychology behind cult-like behavior in religion, politics, and beyond. I'm your host, Chris Shelton, and today we're diving into one of the most famous psychological studies on obedience and how its lessons explain the rise of political cults in America today. In the early 1960s, social psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments that would shake the world. His research revealed a terrifying truth. Ordinary people like you and me, could be led to commit cruel, even dangerous acts simply because an authority figure told them to. These findings weren't just an abstract psychological exercise, they were an attempt to understand the horrors of Nazi Germany, where so many citizens, soldiers, and bureaucrats excused their actions by saying, "I was just following orders." Years later, another psychologist, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the man behind the infamous Stanford prison experiment, looked at Milgram's work and distilled it into 10 lessons on how obedience works. These 10 lessons are a blueprint for manipulation. And today, we're going to examine them one by one, because these same psychological tactics are not just part of history, they're happening right now in political movements that function like cults. And while you who are listening to this right now might immediately jump to your side of the political fence as the good guys who can never be questioned, and it's always the other side that's the cult, I'm going to ask that you set aside that obvious prejudice and listen with objective ears to what I have to say today. Over the past several years, we've watched as millions of Americans have been pulled into a movement that feeds them propaganda, isolates them from opposing viewpoints, and convinces them that their fellow citizens, neighbors, friends, even family members are the enemy. We've seen how this manipulation can lead to threats, harassment, and in some cases, violence. From the January 6th insurrection to political assassinations and domestic terrorism, the patterns of obedience that Milgram and Zimbardo studied decades ago are playing out in real time. So in today's episode, we're going to walk through Zimbardo's 10 lessons from the Milgram study, breaking them down with real-world examples of how these psychological forces are shaping modern political cults. How does loyalty to a leader become a contract that's nearly impossible to break? How does changing language, reframing violence as patriotism, convince people to justify the unjustifiable? And why is it so hard to leave once you're in? By the end of this episode, I hope you'll have a clearer understanding of not just why people fall into political cults, but also how we can help pull them back out. Because while the psychology of obedience can be used to control, it can also be understood and resisted. Let me also add that while most of the actual political cultists are not even going to try to listen to anything I have to say on this matter, I want to be clear that nothing I'm saying in today's show is an effort to demonize anyone or further divide us. Unpleasant truths are hard for a lot of people to hear, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be said. If you are someone who simply cannot listen to criticism of your politics or your leader without flying into a rage, then I think you might have a very serious problem you should get some help with. No one should be so involved in politics or political leaders that they feel the need to hate or hurt other people over such differences. You should be able to hear what people you disagree with have to say without your emotions driving you to violence. That used to be a very uncontroversial thing to say. But enough about that. Time to get to the learning. Before we get into the 10 lessons, let's talk about the man behind the study, Stanley Milgram. Milgram was a social psychologist who wanted to understand why people obey authority, even when it means hurting others. His big question was, could ordinary people commit terrible acts just because they were told to? To find out, he ran an experiment in the 1960s. Volunteers were brought into a lab and told they were helping with a study on learning. They were assigned the role of a teacher and instructed to give electric shocks to a learner whenever the learner got a question wrong. What the volunteers didn't know was that the learner was an actor. They weren't actually being shocked. But as the shocks got stronger, the learner screamed, begged for mercy, and eventually went silent. Even then, many participants kept going just because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. Milgram's experiments were not really shocking people, but the results were shocking. About 2/3 of people obeyed until the highest voltage, when they thought they were seriously harming someone. This showed that ordinary people could be pressured into cruelty if the situation encouraged obedience. His study helps explain why people throughout history have followed orders to do terrible things. This experiment in coerced cruelty has been replicated many times in many places since the 1960s to the same or very similar results. Milgram's experiments are not fake and have not been debunked or disproven. Even a room full of clinical psychologists, when asked, were sure only a small minority of people would ever turn the voltage up to fatal levels just because a doctor in a lab coat told them to, but they were wrong. The harsh reality is that people will kill other perfectly innocent people simply because they're told to, if the conditions are right. And that brings us to the 10 lessons Zimbardo took from this study. Lessons that still shape how power and obedience work today. These are the ways people can be pressured to obey, even when they know something is wrong. 1. Contractual obligation, getting people to agree up front. The first trick is getting people to agree to something small, like signing up for a job, joining a group, or even just saying yes to a request. Once they agree, they feel locked in, even when things change later. It's like when you sign a contract but don't realize there's a catch. In China, under Mao Zedong, citizens were expected to take public loyalty oaths to the Communist Party. At first, these seemed harmless, just a simple way to show support. But later, those same people were pressured to report traitors or attend public executions. Since they'd already sworn loyalty, backing out meant admitting they were wrong, which was dangerous. After 9/11, Americans were encouraged to support our troops. That sounds good, right? But this slogan was used to pressure people into supporting the Iraq War, even if they didn't think it was a good idea. If you spoke against the war, you were told you didn't support the troops. That's how a small agreement, yes, I support the troops, turned into a much bigger one. I have to support this war, even if I don't believe in it. 2. Meaningful roles. Giving people a title that shapes their actions. When people are given a role, like leader, defender, or even victim, they start acting the way they think that role is supposed to behave. This is how people get pulled deeper into dangerous beliefs. In Nazi Germany, ordinary people were given the role of reporting enemies of the state. They weren't soldiers, just regular folks. But because they were given a title, they started spying on their neighbors and turning them in, even if they weren't sure the person had done anything wrong. For a particularly damning account of exactly how this worked, read Christopher Browning's incredible book, Ordinary Men, which describes in detail how ordinary German police officers, not military personnel, were used to annihilate millions of people in and around Germany during the later years of World War II. There are few books that will show you the reality of how well-intentioned people can be turned into absolute monsters in an incredibly short period of time. Closer to home, in the 2020 election, some political groups told their supporters they were defenders of democracy and needed to, quote unquote, watch the polls. Some of these people ended up intimidating voters or spreading false reports about fraud, all because they believed their role was to protect the system, even if the system wasn't actually under attack. 3. Rigid rules that change when convenient. People are told to follow strict rules, but those in power change them whenever they want. This keeps people confused and obedient. Under apartheid, the South African government created rules to keep Black citizens from having rights. But when those rules didn't benefit the government, they changed them. For example, some Black citizens were allowed to vote, but only for leaders with no real power. The rule was a trick to make them think they had a voice. During the COVID pandemic, leaders on both sides of the political spectrum made strict rules for people, like wearing masks or staying home. But some of those same leaders were then caught breaking their own rules. This made people feel like the rules weren't really about safety, but about control, and it caused a lot of distrust. 4. Changing words to hide the truth. Words can make something sound better or worse than it really is. This is called reframing. We've discussed many times how cults will manipulate and redefine ordinary words to mean something completely different so that cult members have a kind of a hidden language. But it's not just in cults that wordplay is important. Propaganda's core tool is using language in crafty or manipulative ways to get people to make associations which would cause them to support, defend, or alternately attack and revile whatever it is the propagandist wants them to. It is so common that people remark on how this sort of thing is done, but somehow they feel they're immune to it. I'm not sure why they think that when we can see that we keep repeating the same mistakes as a society over and over and over again. For example, after 9/11, the US government used the term enhanced interrogation instead of torture when talking about how they treated prisoners. By using a softer phrase, they made something cruel seem more acceptable and even civilized. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the government didn't call it a war. They called it a special military operation. This was done to make their own people feel like it wasn't as bad as it really was. The real kicker to all this is when American or Russian citizens then pick up on these phrases and use them all across social media to defend the undefendable and reframe what is going on in the world in a misguided belief they're supporting their government and being patriotic by defending predatory authoritarians. It's really quite something to behold this happen over and over and over again in history. 5. Passing the blame to an authority figure. When people do something wrong, they don't feel as guilty if they think someone else is responsible. Manipulators and authoritarians constantly use this to dodge taking responsibility for their own actions. So it's pretty natural that their followers would mirror that behavior. Many Nazis defended their actions by saying, "I was just following orders." This excuse helped them avoid responsibility for the terrible things they did. Many people who stormed the US Capitol later said they thought Trump had told them to do it. Some even asked for pardons, claiming they were just following his lead. And unfortunately, in the world we live in now, they got those presidential pardons. 6. Small steps lead to big actions. People are more likely to do something extreme if they start with small, easy steps first. The first step is always something small, almost incidental, and hardly ever recognized until much later as the seed planting that it was. For example, before the Rwandan genocide, radio programs encouraged people to see their neighbors as cockroaches. At first, it was just name calling. Harmless, First Amendment, all good. But over time, people started believing it and then acted on it violently. QAnon started as just strange online posts, but soon followers started believing dangerous ideas, like the belief that government leaders were part of a secret child trafficking ring. Some even turned to violence because they felt like they had to save the children. I doubt anyone on 4chan imagined when they were sharing frog memes that what was happening there would result in a crazed gunman going to the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria with a loaded assault weapon to save children he believed were being held in a sex dungeon under the pizzeria. It's only dumb luck no one lost their lives that day over a totally delusional fantasy that was being shared by millions online. 7. Gradual escalation of harm. If each step gets slightly worse but doesn't seem like a big jump, people will keep going. The gradual increase in intensity, damage, or violence makes it easier to accept, since it's not obvious for quite some time just how far things have escalated since each individual step didn't seem to be that big of a deal. In North Korea, people are taught from a young age to worship their leader. At first, it's just singing songs. Then, it's reporting neighbors. Eventually, some become executioners. Each step feels small, but it leads to extreme obedience. 8. Authority figures who slowly become more extreme. Leaders start reasonable, then slowly push for more power. At first, Philippine President Duterte just talked about cracking down on drugs. But over time, he encouraged police and even regular people to kill suspected drug users. At first, our current political administration talked about cutting taxes for the middle class and draining the swamp of waste and extravagance. Now, an unelected billionaire is somehow in charge of the US government's Human Resources Department and is firing thousands of federal employees, ruining their lives and even future prospects for employment in what can only be described as a situation of the inmates running the asylum. There is not even any precedent for what is happening right now. There has never been such a shameless and bold power grab in the history of the world, yet it seems perfectly reasonable to millions of Americans that this is happening. That is what it looks like when authority figures have crossed so many lines that they are sure no one is going to ever act to stop them. And if no one ever does, then their assumption of power becomes fact, and no one can then stop them for real. It's actually that simple. 9. Making it hard to leave. People stay because they're afraid of losing everything. Many ISIS fighters wanted to leave, but if they did, they'd be killed. The fear of leaving kept them stuck. When one's job or social network is connected closely with their political beliefs, they can feel trapped in a circle of compliance they can't really break free from, where seemingly everyone around them is sort of policing their behavior. If they ever voice dissent or disagreement, it becomes very clear that they may lose their friends, their job, or even their family for being honest. And this is not a partisan position. This is all politics of all stripes. To pour salt into the wound, often authoritarian leadership will seem to concede and allow dissent to be voiced or openly discussed. Yet the entire time that's happening, they will never allow any actual rule violations or loss of work time or discipline. So nothing really changes, even though people may be talking about changing things all the time. 10. Big lies justify terrible things. If you can convince people there's a big enemy, they will accept almost anything to defeat it. And it's not always obvious or epic in proportions either. Not every manipulation is on a grand scale. In Milgram's research, this came in the form of telling the research subjects that science wants to help people improve their memory by judicious use of reward and punishment. It was therefore fully justified that the person on the receiving end of the electric shocks go through a torture session administered not by the person in the lab coat, but the regular, ordinary person who kept pushing the button because they were told to. In the 1950s, Senator McCarthy convinced Americans that communists were everywhere. This big lie led to people being jailed or blacklisted, even if they were innocent. A great many people took advantage of the paranoia stoked by authority during the 1950s to hide their own criminality, such as L. Ron Hubbard, who worked to convince the FBI that the enemies of Scientology were actually communist agents who should be arrested. We see this now in the United States with the so-called deep state, used as a sort of manufactured boogeyman that justifies political purges and witch hunts. Now that we've broken down the 10 lessons from Milgram's study, let's talk about what this actually means in the real world. Because these aren't just theories. They play out in real life, and they have real consequences. Political cults, fueled by propaganda and disinformation, use these same tactics to push people into dangerous behaviors. And when that happens, democracy itself is at risk. One of the biggest dangers is how these tactics break down civil discourse. Instead of seeing political opponents as fellow citizens with different opinions, cult-like groups are trained to see them as enemies. Think about Nazi Germany. The Nazi Party didn't just convince people to follow Hitler, they convinced them that Jewish people, political dissidents, and others were actual threats to their nation. They used the same obedience tactics, the same ideology, and the same slow steps to turn everyday people into participants in unthinkable crimes. This happens in more subtle ways, too. During the McCarthy era in the US, fear of communism turned neighbor against neighbor. People were encouraged to report suspected traitors, quote unquote, ruining careers and lives without any evidence. The government and media created an atmosphere of fear where questioning authority meant you were the enemy. Sound familiar? Today, we see political leaders using these same fear-based tactics, telling their followers that anyone who questions them is part of some evil conspiracy. And let's not forget Jonestown. Jim Jones didn't wake up one day and order his followers to commit mass suicide. He built control slowly, step by step, using obedience, fear, and isolation to make sure his followers trusted only him. By the time he gave his final order, most of them had lost the ability to question him. Those who didn't want to drink the poison were forced to by other Jones followers who were convinced he was right to murder them all. We see this same level of blind trust in political cults today, where followers believe only one leader, ignore all outside information, and are willing to justify anything, even violence, for the cause. This is where it gets dangerous. When political cults normalize violence, whether it's storming a government building, attacking journalists, or threatening their own neighbors, they're following the same psychological patterns that Milgram and Zimbardo warned us about. And history tells us where this can lead. When obedience to authority and loyalty to a movement become more important than truth or morality, people stop thinking for themselves. They stop seeing others as human. And once that happens, democracy is in real trouble. So what can we do? The first step is recognizing these tactics for what they are. When a political leader tells you that you can't trust the media, that you must obey without question, or that violence is the only answer, these are huge warning signs. History has shown us where this path leads, and it's up to all of us to make sure we don't go down it again. And on that note, let's talk about something even more important: how to break free. Because no one is immune to manipulation. But the good news is, once you understand the tactics being used, you can resist them, you can see them, and you can help others see them too. The first step is recognizing the warning signs. If a leader or movement tells you that you can't question them, that you should only trust their version of reality, or that people outside the group are dangerous or evil, well, those are red flags. Political cults survive by keeping their followers trapped in an us versus them mindset. The moment you start asking, what if they're wrong? That's the moment their control starts to weaken. It's not sometimes a red flag, it's always a red flag when someone is trying to keep you away from other perspectives and points of view. There is not one human being anywhere who has a unique or special line to the truth or who knows everything. To believe that about anyone is actually cult-like thinking. This is why critical thinking and media literacy are so important. Propaganda works by feeding people a steady diet of half-truths and outright lies, designed to make them afraid, angry, and loyal to a cause. Learning how to fact-check, how to spot misleading arguments, and how to separate opinion from fact is one of the best defenses against manipulation. Schools should teach this. Families should talk about it. Because when people know how to recognize disinformation, they become significantly harder to control. Breaking free from manipulation and coercion is not easy, but it's possible. Take someone like Stephen Hassan, a former member of the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. He was deeply involved. He fully believed in their teachings. But over time, with help from loved ones, he was able to step back and realize he had been manipulated. Now, he helps others escape cults, including political ones. Or look at Derek Black. He was raised in a white nationalist family and was seen as the future of that movement. But through conversations with people outside his bubble, he started questioning what he had been taught. Eventually, he walked away completely. Stories like these prove that people can change. No one is too far gone. So, how can you help if someone you love is caught in this cycle? First, understand that arguing doesn't work. If you attack their beliefs head on, they'll just dig in deeper. Instead, ask questions. Be patient. Help them find cracks in the narrative on their own. Encourage curiosity. How do you know that's true? Have you looked at different sources? People don't leave cult-like beliefs because they're forced to. They leave when they start questioning things for themselves. And finally, we have to make it easier for people to leave. One reason people stay in extremist movements is that they fear rejection. If they admit they were wrong, they think they'll be humiliated or abandoned. And sometimes they're right. That's why it's so important to welcome people back. Let them know that changing their mind is not a weakness, it's a strength. The more we create a culture that values growth over blind loyalty, the harder it will be for cult-like movements to take hold. The fight against propaganda and manipulation is not easy, but it is one that we can win. It starts with awareness, with education, and with kindness. Because the best way to break people out of a cult mindset isn't with anger. It's with care, compassion, and understanding. Don't argue about the truth with someone who can't or won't think outside their box. They won't accept your version of reality or the truth, but they will see that you care, and they will see that you are honestly invested in their well-being, and that is what they will respond to. Okay, I want to thank you for listening to my show today. I hope that at least some of this was helpful, educational, and maybe entertaining. Let me know in the comments what you think. What do you agree or disagree with? Did I get anything wrong? How can we get more of this kind of information out there? I'm very interested in your feedback. Please support this show and my channel on Patreon and YouTube, and give this video or podcast a like and a share, and get it around to your friends and that sort of thing. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.